The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Donald Trump's assault on truth and how we repair the damage, why journalists are signing up to give the climate story the coverage it demands, plus Bill Press on what's at stake if the Affordable Care Act is struck down. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you could join us. Kyle Pope says the science is clear, but too often, journalists are not. For too long, the U.S. media have downplayed and distorted the climate change story, with devastating consequences. That's why he has co-founded a new initiative involving over 60 news organizations to get the story right. And we say hello to Kyle Pope, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review and co-founder, along with Mark Hertsgaard, of Covering Climate Now. Kyle Pope, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with the basics. What is the Covering Climate Now project, and who are some of your partners on the project?
So the project is an effort to basically get media in general, but especially media in the U.S., to sort of step up their game when it comes to covering the climate crisis. This is one of these cases where the story is much bigger than the amount of coverage it's receiving. So, we've been trying to think about, and, there's been a lot of complaining about this, and there's been a lot of like, why isn't the media doing better? And I do think that there's been a failure of the press in general, but especially television and especially local television to convey the enormity of the crisis that we're in. So we were thinking about what can we do about this? I mean, CJR, one of the things we have is we have an audience of all these people, especially local TV and mid-sized newspapers, as well as larger media outlets. And so we were thinking, what could we do to kind of galvanize people? I teamed up with The Nation, who and a colleague of mine there named Mark Hertsgaard. He and I had done a project earlier that was unrelated to climate, and so we teamed up first for a piece that ran in The Nation and CJR about the media's failure around climate, and then we held an event here where we got together journalists and activists and scientists, all to think about why isn't the media doing a better job and what would have to happen for them to do that. And then we sort of came up with this idea of trying to focus people's attention on a very short window of time, because it's, what we found is if we tell people you're not doing a good job covering the climate crisis, you need to do better, they'll say, yeah, you're right, and then sort of go on with their day.
Right.
So we thought, what can we do to really focus people's attention? So we came up with this idea of, why could you just commit to upping your game for a week, 1 week of intense climate coverage, however is appropriate to your community. Like we're not here to tell people what to write. We're just saying there's a climate story everywhere. Find the climate story in your area and do that story this week. And the idea really, granted it's a bit of a stunt, but what it's intended to do is to get people to start to understand how they need to change the structure of their newsrooms, or how they need to change the structure of their beats, or how they need to rethink their beats to make climate an integral part of everything that they do. And then what we'll do after that week is we'll sit down with people and say, okay, well, what did you learn? What do you need? Do you need sources? Do you need ideas? Do you need to look at other coverage that you could sort of mimic? Would that be helpful? So it's really like let's focus it on this week. let's figure out what people need after that, and then we can sort of help them on a kind of longer term basis after that. It's the week of September 16th, which is the week before a UN climate summit here in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to back up a little, because one of the goals of the project is, and I'll quote, break the climate silence that still pervades too much of the news media, close quote. Why would there be silence on an issue that has the potential to affect our lives so deeply?
Well, I mean, this is rooted in, partly it's rooted in disinformation. I mean, there's been as you know, like decades-long push primarily by fossil fuel companies to sort of cloud the issue of climate and to cloud the question of what the sources of the climate changes are. And so, and it's been a talking point of one of the major political parties in the country to sort of sow doubt on the issue and raise questions about the issue. I think in a disingenuous way. I mean, I think we're now way past the point where the science is very clear. But it still is it still in some parts of the country is deemed a partisan issue. And I think that, and this is a problem that we have with the press on a lot of fronts. I mean, it also has to do with their coverage of, I mean, let's look at just the past, few days in the country where we've had these terrible shootings, and there's been this sort of like, still a bit of hands-off coverage of the causes of some of this violence in the country, and not a willingness to sort of say it for what it is. The same thing has been happening in climate. So we still, I mean, as we've been working with news outlets over the last few months to get them to commit to this week of coverage, we still hear from people. And to me, it's amazing that we hear this in 2019, that they're worried that increased climate coverage will be seen as political for them, that it will turn off some of their audience, that it's depressing, that they're worried that if they air this or write this, people will turn away. I think these conceptions are outdated. I think, especially if you look at younger people, I mean, they are completely engaged and activated by climate coverage. They're not. It's the opposite of walking away. They're sort of facing it and addressing it. So I think people have kind of outmoded views of what kind of climate coverage would mean for them, and that's one of the things we're trying to change.
Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't just about devoting more time to covering the climate emergency, but also changing the way it's covered. What are some of those changes that you're hoping to see?
Well, I mean, I think one of the main things we want to accomplish, or we want to come out of this, is getting rid of this notion that climate coverage should be siloed in a sort of special bucket. Like, we have all of our coverage and then we have climate stories. I don't think that's the way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is every story is a climate story, whether you're writing about business or sports or the arts or politics or the school board. I mean, everything has a climate angle, and everything is affected by what's happening with the climate. So what we're trying to do is get people to sort of break down all of these silos that they now think about. Because one of the pushbacks that we've received from people is, yeah, we know, this is a big story, but what are the sort of like tragic things about this moment that we're in is that the climate emergency is coming to a head at exactly the time that the news media in the U.S. and frankly around the world is in a severe business crisis, right? There's fewer reporters, there's fewer outlets, there's just fewer resources. So we hear a lot from people like, it's no good if you're going to come tell us we need to add a climate reporter, or we need to sort of pull somebody off of covering the courts to cover climate because it's not realistic and we're not going to do it. And I totally sympathize with that. So what we're trying to do is tell them, like, look, we're not asking you to add anything. We're asking you to have everybody do climate as part of their regular job, which I think is warranted by the story. And it's warranted by the sort of the state we're in. So, and frankly, I think a lot of that, I think people are open to it. I think they just they need help in just sort of thinking through what does that look like and what are the kind of stories. I mean, for instance, like I was talking to somebody down in Texas, and they were talking about how for the first time ever, the football team there can't do full uniform workouts in August because it's too hot. And it's never happened before. And I mean, I actually happen to be from Texas, and I know that's a big deal, right?
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
Football story in Texas is a big deal. So, I mean, what I was saying is, like, that's a climate story. That's exactly what we're talking about. Do the story about this, but the reason it's happening is because of what's happening with the climate. And to me, it's a good example of how you kind of reframe and rethink everything you do.
We're speaking with Kyle Pope, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review and co-founder with Mark Hertsgaard of Covering Climate Now. And Kyle, you've written that one of journalism's most sacred responsibilities is to foster constructive debates. Given that there are still those in leadership positions who argue that climate change is not man-made, what are the constructive debates we should be having?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote about constructive debates, that wasn't what I was talking about. I mean, I don't think we need to engage in climate denial as if it's a legitimate alternative to the science, because I don't think it is. And I think the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of scientists, in fact, I would say the overwhelming majority of credible scientists, are all decided. So I don't think that is the debate that we need to be engaging in, because I don't think it's legitimate. I think there is a lot of legitimate questions about what do you do about it? How do you pay for it? What is the level of personal responsibility we all have, and what does that look like? How should we be living our lives different? How should we be making choices about where we live? How should we be sort of funneling government and private resources? Those are all totally legitimate and worthwhile subjects of discussion that I think are going to make for a lot of good stories. I'm not talking about is climate change real and is it man-made? That question is settled. So it's all the other stuff that falls out from that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned young people earlier, and obviously they play a unique role in the story, but many express hopelessness and anger that older generations have abandoned their future. How does the project speak to them? We're trying to, as much as we can, to engage with these younger people. I mean, when we had this sort of kickoff conference, one of the speakers that was there was one of the activists who at the time was 13. I think she's now 14. But I mean, these people are super media savvy. I mean, at that event, there was this like sort of electric exchange when there was somebody from the New York Times who was there, who helps in their climate coverage, who was saying that, yeah, they take these student activists seriously and that they're interested and they're paying attention to them. And this woman whose name is Alexandria Villaseñor, who was one of the student activists, spoke up right in the moment and said, actually, what you're saying isn't true. Like, I've emailed you, and she pointed to this reporter. I've emailed you several times, and you never respond to my emails. I mean, these students are like, they're quite savvy. I mean, and it's also really fascinating to me. You know, they've been doing these weekly strikes around the country and around the world, actually, for a while now. And they earlier this summer, they decided to target media. I mean, their first strike was at Fox. It was at News Corp in Manhattan. And they're going to be continuing. And they had the week previous to that, they had a strike in front of the New York Times. So, I mean, they're really starting to think a lot about media and the media's failures around this. So I think you're going to, I mean, and my own view, and I would think this because of my job, but I think the crisis now is, as much as anything, is a media crisis. I mean, we have to get the press to be paying attention to this in a way that is going to result in action, both from the public and from policymakers. And the fact that the TV networks in the U.S. devoted more coverage to the royal baby in Britain than in the climate crisis earlier this year is an example of why there needs to be a fundamental change and a fundamental rethinking. Absolutely. The focused week of coverage in September, again, timed to a UN Climate Action Summit in New York. How do you envision that rolling out? I mean, are we talking newsrooms across the country of all different sizes participating in this, or are we sort of at the beginning of this?
No, we published a few weeks ago, so this would have been in late July. The initial partners, which was it was about 60 news organizations, primarily U.S. but also from around the world, ranging from CBS News and The Guardian and The Intercept and Slate and Harvard Business Review and Nature. I mean, you can go to cjr.org and look at all these outlets, to the Asahi Shimbun, the largest news organization in Japan. And we published that in late July. And after we published that, we've just been, frankly, sort of, just deluged with other people wanting to sign on. So we'll be publishing soon. I imagine that by the time September 16th rolls around, we'll have, well over 100 news organizations that have signed up, which, I think is probably the largest organizing effort to get media focused on coverage of a single topic over a period like this. I don't think anybody's ever tried this before. So I think it's pretty exciting. I think it's exciting that people are interested and that they're doing it. All we've asked people is, whatever you might normally do more of it, or if you don't do anything, commit to doing something. And it ranges wildly. I mean, one of our partners is Inside Climate News, which I'm sure you know about. This is what they do every day, but they're really going to be putting a sort of special report together and having some pretty aggressive coverage for that week. Similar, The Guardian is doing the same thing. CBS News will be branding some of its coverage that week. So everybody will be having coverage. We'll be tagging all the coverage with the Covering Climate Now label, so everybody will know that it's sort of related. And then we and the other partners, whoever wants, but we at CJR and at The Nation will be running all of the stories, links to all of the stories on our website so you can see what everybody's doing. And we're going to start over the next month or so, we're going to start teasing what various partners may be doing. Some people view this as a competitive issue and they don't want to tell everybody what their plans are, which is totally fine with us. In fact, that means that they're excited about it and we're into that. But for those who are, we'll be able to say, these people are going to be launching this series. These people are going to sort of launch a whole new vertical, and we'll be sort of detailing that. And then afterwards, we'll be sort of categorizing and commenting on the stories. Like, here's what. And this is where you really have the opportunity for people to learn about this or learn about what the possibilities are. So we could, we'll say, hey, these people did this. Here's a story that everybody knows about, every community can relate to, about declines in the water level of the local reservoir. Here is an outlet that sort of thought about it in a new way and used historical photographs to show the effects of it. And the idea is like, steal this story, take that idea and do the same thing in your community. And we're also, we're starting also to, it's just fascinating. Like all these outlets have never before sort of been in communication with each other. And we have, news outlets from Scandinavia, from Australia, from Europe, from U.S., big and small, and just getting these people all together virtually just to talk about what they're doing is also incredibly valuable.
I think it's a fantastic idea, a brilliant approach, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Kyle Pope, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, co-founder along with Mark Hertzgaard of Covering Climate Now. And again, that big week coming up, the week of September 16th, timing to a UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Hoping for the best and hoping for continued success, and just want to thank you for taking the time to fill us in on everything, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the difference between fake news, pseudo-news, and legitimate journalism, and why it matters. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
While the Trumpistas are presently plowing a multi-billion-dollar subsidy into big grain farms, they're using a tangle of federal red tape in a mingy effort to deny a meager level of food assistance to millions of poor families. To qualify for food aid, federal rules say that a family of 3 should have an income under $27,000 a year. But with rents, utilities, health care, and even food prices constantly rising, millions of Americans can't make ends meet on such a low income. Thus, 40 states have stepped in to loosen that restriction so families at least get the basic nutrition they need. Trump's minions demean these people as welfare moochers, but overwhelmingly, they're working families, children, the elderly, and Americans with disabilities. And the benefit is hardly lavish, averaging only $127 a month. But even this modest outlay has proven enormously successful in mitigating poverty. Congress actually authorized states to make such pragmatic income adjustments in a 1996 revamp of the law. But look out, here comes Trump's reactionary ag secretary, Sonny Perdue. He recently rose up on his hind legs to proclaim that naughty state officials are using that authority as a loophole to circumvent Trump's federal authority. So Sonny and Donnie are demanding a whole new bureaucracy of eligibility police to monitor the financial assets of food stamp recipients. They'll spend tens of millions of your and my tax dollars to harass the poor in an autocratic hope of nabbing a couple of hungry families who have a dime more in assets than miserly Trumpistas claim they should have. This is Jim Hightower saying, what we have here is government by plutocratic authoritarians who will dole out millions in tax breaks and subsidies to wealthy families, then take food off the tables of poor families.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Well before his inauguration, Donald Trump launched a viral assault on the press and the very notion of truth itself. Since then, the attacks have only escalated. Brian Ott is a communications scholar who examines the intersection of rhetoric, media, and democratic discourse. He says the president has spearheaded a credibility crisis, and it relies on all of us to repair the damage. And we say hello to Brian Ott, professor of communication studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University. His chief research interest concerns the intersection of rhetoric and media, and he studies how communication technologies influence and shape the character of public discourse. He's also the author, along with Greg Dickinson, of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump, and the Politics of White Rage. Brian Ott, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. Recently, you've been writing about the phenomenon of fake news and how it has evolved, especially in the hands of Donald Trump. So let's start with some basics. How do you define fake news, and how does it differ from what may be called its cousins, propaganda and misinformation?
Let me start by saying that fake news is an absolutely real phenomenon, but that it does not mean at all what the president uses it to mean. So about 10 years ago, when scholars employed the phrase fake news, they were typically referring to satirical news programs like the Daily Show or the Colbert Report. But today, fake news means something entirely different. With the rise of social media and the proliferation of mobile technology, more and more people are turning to the internet to get their news and information. Now, unfortunately, much of that information is unvetted and does not conform to rigorous journalistic standards. This has created a context in which fake news flourishes. So, to answer your question, fake news refers to the deliberate spread of information designed to deceive, but which has been packaged to look like credible journalism. Simply put, fake news involves disinformation as opposed to misinformation, whereas misinformation is information that is unintentionally wrong or misleading. Fake news is intentionally misleading. So basically, fake news is a specific form of propaganda, and propaganda refers to any strategic use of disinformation to advance a specific political agenda. In 2016, for instance, the Russian government widely deployed fake news on social media as part of its larger propaganda campaign to help elect Donald Trump president of the United States.
It's reasonable to say, I think, that many news sources contain some kind of political bias. Where do you draw the line between bias and something more insidious?
Yes, so news organizations in the United States have a political slant, though it's very difficult to measure the particular degree of political bias in the news because it assumes a neutral, unbiased center from which to judge it. That having been said, while mainstream media outlets in the United States may have political biases, they generally cannot meaningfully be considered fake news because they do not intentionally traffic in disinformation. On the contrary, when legitimate news organizations make mistakes in reporting, they correct them. Now, the matter of bias is further complicated by the popularity in the United States of political opinion and commentary programming on television. So most of what airs, for instance, on the Fox News network falls into this category. This type of programming is not fake news so much as it is pseudo news. It is entertainment, which people wrongly treat as news. But like fake news, it does not observe journalistic standards or codes of ethics. The proliferation of pseudo news, which typically has very strong political biases, has made detecting actual fake news even more difficult.
And that's a lot for people to have to try and decipher and sift through to figure out what's real and what's not. I mean, the dangers of that are unending, I would think. Moving on to the specific narrative around fake news, as you've noted, Donald Trump did not begin to actively use the term until after he was elected, yet his attack on the press began long before. How did he accomplish that, and how do you understand his early intent?
So let me start by saying that Donald Trump has weaponized the concept of fake news, using it to undermine legitimate news outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And meanwhile, he treats pseudo-news programs like Hannity or Justice with Judge Jeanine on Fox News as actual news, rather than as political opinion programming. But as you note, even before he began to muddy these categories by using the phrase fake news, he had an antagonistic relationship with the press. So prior to being elected, his tendency was to attack specific journalists who were critical of him, such as when he attacked Katie Tur or Megyn Kelly, or when he mocked a New York Times reporter with a disability during the 2016 campaign. Now, Trump's rhetoric has always involved degradation. Trump is so thin-skinned that when someone says something critical of him, he attacks them personally. So early on, Trump simply treated journalists the same way he treats his political opponents, namely by publicly degrading them.
Well, by now, as you have noted, Trump has tweeted fake news close to 500 times. And all of this began around Inauguration Day. So what changed?
So as you just noted, Trump uses the phrase fake news all the time, but he did not use it until after he was elected president. He went from critiquing individual journalists during the 2016 presidential campaign to the wholesale rejection of media outlets with the phrase fake news, and this was around Inauguration Day. What changed is that the various news outlets began to uncover and report on Russian efforts to help elect him president. Since the Russian government had specifically mobilized fake news as part of its propaganda campaign to get him elected, Trump's redefinition, his seizure on fake news as a concept was particularly pernicious because it simultaneously clouded what Russia had done during the campaign and undermined credible news outlets' efforts to report on Russian propaganda efforts. So basically, Trump invented his own idea or version of fake news to confuse the public and to obscure the facts that were emerging about how Russia had aided his campaign.
We're speaking with Brian Ott, professor of communication studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University. He's also author with Greg Dickinson of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump, and the Politics of White Rage. Brian, since his inauguration, fake news and enemy of the people have become standard operating procedure for the president. How have his motives and his strategy evolved over time?
So the legitimacy of the 2016 election and hence of Trump's presidency was called into question by the rapidly emerging stories about Russian propaganda and the specter that his campaign had actively colluded with a foreign government to win the election. As the facts of this story began to emerge and to be reported not in one outlet, but in multiple news outlets, Trump could no longer respond by just demeaning individual journalists. And furthermore, after years of sort of false and racist accusations about the legitimacy of Barack Obama as president, Donald Trump was facing the very real possibility that he was, in fact, illegitimately elected. Now, this, of course, was a huge blow to Trump's ego. So he declared war, seeking to destroy the public's faith in America's fourth estate, our news media. And sadly, this has been remarkably effective with his base. And there seems to be some susceptibility there to conspiracy theory. In fact, this strategy was so effective at countering the Russia collusion story that Trump now uses it or employs it to undermine any story that he doesn't like. So following the tragic shooting in El Paso, for instance, Trump inexplicably suggested that the fake news media was somehow to blame. He did this, of course, to distract from the ways that his own racist rhetoric has fueled domestic terrorism and white supremacy in the United States.
That was definitely one that I think left a lot of people shaking their head, to say the least. And Brian, you recently wrote an article for Newsweek noting that even Fox News is not safe from the president's attacks. Why would he go after a news source considered largely in his camp?
This is complicated, but it's important to unpack. So, as I mentioned earlier, Fox News is dominated by political opinion and commentary programming like Hannity and Tucker Carlson Tonight and the Laura Ingraham Show. These pseudo-news programs are overwhelmingly supportive of the president, but they are not actually news programs, and their hosts are not actually journalists. Sean Hannity is not a journalist. He's a conservative pundit, a fact that both he and Fox News have acknowledged, admittedly somewhat reluctantly. There are, however, actual journalists like Shepard Smith on Fox News, and there's just enough of them to confuse the fact that most of the programming on the network is political entertainment. The few legitimate journalists on Fox News increasingly understand the real danger Trump poses to democracy, and they have begun to say as much. So Trump has gone after them as well. Now, to date, Trump's use of fake news has been aimed primarily at undermining the credibility of legitimate news sources, even those at Fox News. Meanwhile, he has treated political entertainment or pseudo-news as legitimate journalism, and he frequently retweets it on Twitter.
What is your sense of the damage this kind of rhetoric has caused? I mean, when the President of the United States says you cannot trust journalism, what's left for Americans to believe in?
Yeah, despite his own career as a sort of huckster and TV personality, Trump has somehow managed to convince his followers that he is more trustworthy than the mainstream news media. Now, they trust him because they connect with him at an emotional level. His nationalistic and racist rhetoric resonates with them. In short, Trump has created a credibility crisis in the United States. A large segment of the public now trusts a man who has told nearly 11,000 lies since being elected president and distrusts legitimate news outlets who are doing their best to inform them on matters of public importance and who correct their mistakes when they make them. This credibility crisis is exacerbated by the problem of political opinion and commentary programming on television, and also by the spread of actual fake news on social media platforms, where people tend to seek out information that confirms what they already believe and avoid or dismiss information that challenges their existing beliefs.
So what can the press do to repair whatever breach of trust that this president has caused?
That's a difficult but important question. Three interlocking forces have created the crisis of credibility I've been describing in the news. One, the rise of political entertainment programming on television and cable television specifically. Two, the turn toward social media as a source of news and information. And three, the election of Donald Trump and his anti-media rhetoric. If there is any hope of reversing this crisis in credibility, we will need to respond to each one of these challenges. And frankly, that responsibility falls more on everyday citizens than it does on the news media. First, we have to stop treating political opinion and commentary programs on Fox News like they are actual news. This is right-wing political commentary. It is rooted in racism and hate, and it is dividing and destroying our country. Second, we must stop turning to social media for news, and we must be ever vigilant in our critical assessment of the information that we consume in that environment. And finally, we must vote Donald Trump out of office. He is a dangerous demagogue whose repeated attacks on a free and independent press threaten the very foundations of our democracy.
Amen to that. Brian Ott, professor of communication studies and director of the TTU Press at Texas Tech University, also the author with Greg Dickinson of The Twitter Presidency, Donald J. Trump, and the Politics of White Rage, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Brian, as always, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Donald Trump's effort to destroy American health care and what it will take to save the Affordable Care Act. Bill Press talks with Brad Woodhouse, president of Protect Our Care.
Healthcare was the number one issue in 2018.
Yeah.
And Democrats picked up 45 congressional seats. Is healthcare going to be the number one issue in 2020?
Well, so far, every poll that we've conducted and almost every poll that we've seen has said that it is. Now, you'll have moments, as you should right now, where we're having a debate about guns and gun safety and race and fanning the flames of these violent events where that will really pop. But healthcare is the steady issue. And, we saw it in 2018. It really rose up as a result of the effort of President Trump and Republicans to repeal the Affordable Care Act. It has really maintained that. And it's partly because it is a really important economic issue for people. It is the part of people's personal economies where they feel the most strain, where they're paying high out-of-cost costs for health care, and they're also paying high costs for prescription drugs.
Right. In terms of the cost, I saw a figure the other day where the average cost per capita in this country is about $9,400, which is more than double what it is for such backward countries as Canada or Germany or France or Switzerland or Spain or the Netherlands. Why? And so it looks like we are spending more and getting less.
We are, and that is a significant thing that we need to do something about. And it was one thing that the Affordable Care Act didn't do enough of, which was to get control of the cost. Now, there are things going on Capitol Hill right now, even bipartisan things, to help some, one of which is ending the surprise medical bill. So the cost that people are paying when they go to the hospital and it happens to be out of network, or when they go to the emergency room and it happens to be out of network. We think on an immediate time frame that Congress, and this obviously won't happen with Mitch McConnell and his legislative graveyard, we should think that they should raise the premium subsidies above 400% of poverty and increase the size of the subsidies for people below 400% of poverty. Of course, it would help if Medicaid had been expanded in every state, so a greater number of people had access to that coverage at a lower cost. So even in the confines, and of course the presidential debate on our side, on the Democratic side, is having a debate about coverage, Medicare for all, Medicare option. But even in the confines of the current law or the current structure of the Affordable Care Act, there's a lot that could be done to address cost. But Republicans and President Trump are too busy trying to rip apart American health care to actually see that there are things that could be done to help people in the immediate time frame, like the subsidies and Medicaid expansion.
Well, in fact, the president says every time he turns around, the Affordable Care Act is dead. Of course, he calls it Obamacare is dead.
Right.
Obamacare is dead. I killed it.
Right.
Is it dead?
It's not at all. And in fact, it has. The resiliency of the Affordable Care Act is really, I think, an untold story. I mean, it has survived every attempt that he has made to disrupt the marketplace, to repeal the law. Obviously, repeal was not successful. Now, they have definitely harmed American healthcare. I mean, they have harmed it, and they're trying to harm it. They've undermined open enrollment, which we think has held enrollment numbers down. They have tried to adopt rules to discourage people from staying on or signing up for
Didn't they cut
Medicaid.
The advertising so that
they
people
cut
would know?
The advertising. They cut
people
the
would
outreach.
know this is the time to sign up.
They cut the advertising budget by 90%. They cut the outreach budget. They don't have as many navigators going out to help the groups that are on the ground in the states that are signing people up. They shorten the time period. They shut down the website inexplicably on Sundays for some reason. Like people don't shop on Sundays online. And so, and they have systematically done all these things. Yet, with that said, there are still 130 million Americans that have pre-existing conditions that have some level of protection and assurance because the Affordable Care Act says insurance companies can't discriminate against people any longer with pre-existing conditions. You have 20 million people who have gained health care coverage through the Affordable Care Act. Women are treated more fairly. Reproductive rights are treated more fairly. Contraception is treated more fairly. Kids are on their parents' policies. And so the donut hole for seniors in Medicare Part D is closing or has been closed. And so there are so many benefits that are still there despite what the president has tried to do. That said, there are millions of people uninsured now that were insured, or the number of people uninsured has risen during this administration because of their sabotage. But the law is still there. The protections in the law are still there. The requirement that insurance companies spend 85% of their revenue on benefits and coverage is still there.
Can people still sign up for
Obamacare? They can still sign up. There'll be
marketplaces
still open. There'll be an open enrollment period. I believe it will run again this year from November 1st, roughly November 1st to December 15th. But there have to be people need to make themselves aware of that. We're really always encouraging supporters of this law, Democratic lawmakers. We would encourage Republican lawmakers too, to make sure their constituents know about the open enrollment period. We have funded some private, nonprofit open enrollment efforts, and we'll be responsible for funding some of that. But there's no replacement for what the Department of Health and Human Services could do or is supposed to do or did do in the Obama years in terms of letting people know that they can sign up and that many of them can sign up at virtually no cost, that they'll qualify for a premium subsidy.
So you mentioned a couple of times pre-existing conditions. Yeah. Donald Trump says he's totally on the side of people with pre-existing conditions. He'll do everything to protect them and make sure that they have that protection.
Shocker, he's a liar. I mean, that is a bald-faced lie. It is not true. First of all, if you're going to require insurance companies to cover people with pre-existing conditions and not charge them more and not kick them off their coverage when they get sick or when they need it, you have to have something like the Affordable Care Act in place that incentivizes insurance companies and makes them whole for providing. Look, insurance companies had their way, and they did up until the Affordable Care Act. They provide coverage to the healthiest people they could, and then they charged sicker people more or refused to cover them because they're in the business of making money. The Affordable Care Act said, look, we're going to provide subsidies. We're going to expand the marketplace. We're going to expand Medicaid. We're going to get you more customers, but you've got to cover people with pre-existing conditions. You can't charge them more and you can't deny them coverage. So Republicans just say that they'll get rid of the Affordable Care Act, but they'll wave a magic wand and cover people with pre-existing conditions. Unless they put something like the Affordable Care Act back in its place, it's impossible, number one. Number two, I don't believe that they actually want to do it. They're in a political bind because this last election, they lost the House on health care, and the number one health care issue going into the election was pre-existing conditions. And so now they just feel like they have to say something. But all of their policies, including this Texas lawsuit, imperils those protections.
I was just going to say, at the time that they are promising to protect people with pre-existing conditions, the Trump administration is in court with several state attorneys general to nullify the entire
law. Every single word and comma. They want to declare the law unconstitutional, which would get rid of the entire law. It wouldn't keep in place the parts that they say that they like or the parts that they claim that they want to continue to help people. It would get rid of the entire law. So you can't. Plus the repeal. Every repeal bill they ever brought, the one that passed the House, the one that John McCain voted down in the Senate, and the one that came later that they couldn't get Graham Cassidy, they couldn't get enough votes for, all of them would have gotten rid of these protections. They would not have been in place any longer. So the only reason you hear Donald Trump saying that is he's trying to get right on health care, so it's not a losing issue for him in the next election. It's not because he believes any of this.
What does it tell you that during the campaign, candidate Donald Trump said, day one, I'm going to kill Obamacare, get rid of Obamacare. Day one, Obamacare. Here we are, +2+ years into the Trump administration, and as you just pointed out, it may not be doing as well as it was under President Obama, but the Affordable Care Act is still there.
Still there. It's still there.
Protecting people. Even in its weak in the state, it's still protecting people. Why couldn't they get rid of it? What does that tell you?
Well, first of all, just remind you, on day one, I believe it was on the day of his inauguration, it may have been on the next day, his very first executive order he signed was direct. This is one of these BS things that really had probably no force of law, but he signed an executive order telling his cabinet agencies to begin dismantling Obamacare. It was the very first thing he did as president. And I believe the reason that they have failed is a prediction that a lot of us made in 2009, 2010, we were trying to get it passed, that took too long to come to fruition, which was once it was fully implemented and once people learned what benefits they were getting, they got additional coverage, that they had pre-existing conditions covered, that they would appreciate the benefits from the law and it would become more popular than less popular. Now, that didn't happen right away. First of all, as you know, very few of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act took place in the immediate aftermath of its passage. And then, of course, we had the unfortunate situation with the website, the first open enrollment. So it took a lot longer for people to begin to benefit. And then I think some people were benefiting from the Affordable Care Act and didn't even know it. They didn't realize that the insurance companies were now forced to cover them or their families that had pre-existing conditions. But then I think they clued in when it became under real threat. Yeah. When the House passed their version and they went up the lawn with the president and celebrated, and people realized, oh my God, this could really go away, they rose up.
Right. Now, there are those, as no matter how good Obamacare is, there are those critics, and I'm one of them, that Obamacare doesn't do enough, doesn't go far enough. There are too many, still millions of Americans, tens of millions of Americans who are not covered. Doesn't do anything about prescription drugs. You could go on and on. Right. Didn't have a public option.
Right.
Can Obamacare be fixed? Should it be fixed?
Look, our position is that it should be fixed, and that it can be fixed, and it can accomplish almost everything that every Democrat wants to do with respect to universal coverage. And there are a lot of great ideas. Out there, and that adding a public option, making a real through ballot initiatives and other things, making a big run at getting the rest of the states. We have 37 states that have passed Medicaid expansion. We have the rest that we need to get done, expanding the subsidies and making more people eligible for the subsidies, and then passing, separate from either the Affordable Care Act or any other proposal for coverage, passing a prescription drug bill that requires that HHS negotiate with prescription drug companies to lower the price of prescription drugs under Medicare and apply those savings to the entire market. So every consumer would benefit. You can't charge less for a Medicare recipient and more for someone else. So those things could all be done. But our major position is that and this is what we're on the Hill fighting for every day, is focus on the here and now. Get a Medicare prescription negotiation bill passed. The number one issue in the mind of voters right now is as it relates to healthcare, is high-cost prescription drugs. Get that done. Get that passed in the House. Raise the bar for them in the Senate. And you know what? If they all come together and President Trump signs that into law, well, God bless America. It may take a political issue away from us, but it would be the right thing to do for the American people.
Right. And again, as you know, there are some candidates running for president in 2020 say, even so, you do all those fixes, you still got a system that has private insurance companies there, And that's not good enough. We got to do a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Maybe even single payer. We're going to take a quick break.
Yeah.
When we come back, I want to talk to you about what people are saying for running for president for 2020 ought to be done about health care.
Absolutely.
Bill Press talking with Brad Woodhouse, Executive Director of Protect Our Care. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. Well, that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Kyle Pope, Brian Ott, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.